Welcome back to the Global Ledger. I'm Justin. Eventually, every cycle leads to the same question. Why isn't monetary policy working anymore? Rates have moved, statements have been issued, facilities exist, and markets are aware. And yet, growth stalls, or inflation behaves strangely, or even financial stress refuses to go away. This episode is about that moment. Not when policy fails spectacularly, but when it stops transmitting the way people expect. Because monetary policy doesn't stop working all at once, it loses traction, layer by layer. Let's get into it. When we talk about monetary policy working, what do we mean? What do we mean by that? We need to define what success means with that, okay? So monetary policy is considered working when markets respond to policy signals, when financial conditions adjust, when credit flows change behavior, okay? And economic outcomes follow with a lag. Notice something important. Policy is never direct. It's always mediated, okay? So when people say policy stopped working, what they usually mean is the transmission mechanism weakened. That's a very different diagnosis. Policy does not control behavior. This is the first misconception to clear. Monetary policy does not force borrowing, force lending, force investment, or force spending. It changes incentives. When incentives no longer alter behavior, policy appears ineffective, even if tools are still in place. That's not because policy disappeared, it's because conditions changed. So the first failure point is saturation. One way policy loses effectiveness is in this way. Okay, so this happens when rates are already low or already high. Happens when balance sheets are already large and guidance is already well understood. Okay, at that point, additional moves produce diminishing effects. Markets have priced the path. Borrowers have adjusted. Lenders have set constraints. Policy still exists, but it stops surprising anyone. And surprise is often what moves behavior. Okay, so that's the first failure. The second failure point, balance sheet constraints. Another failure point sits inside institutions. Even if policy encourages lending, banks may be capital constrained. Dealers may be balance sheet constrained. Non-banks may be risk constrained. Okay, policy can make funding cheaper, but it cannot manufacture balance sheet capacity in any way. So when leverage limits bind, transmission starts to weaken, and rates can move. Words can be spoken, and credit still doesn't flow. So that's the second failure. Okay, the third failure point, I think, is confidence. Policy also relies on confidence. Think about this. Confidence that liquidity will be there when it's needed. Confidence that prices will remain orderly. And confidence that counterparties will perform. When confidence breaks, risk aversion dominates, hoarding begins, and policy signals lose force. This is why policy works best in calm environments and struggles most during stress. Ironically, that's when it's needed most. So that's the third failure point. The fourth failure point, structural change. Sometimes policy stops working not because of the cycle, but because the system has changed. Some examples of this are financial intermediation shifting outside banks, okay? Credit moving into less regulated spaces, or new funding structures replacing old ones. Policy tools built for yesterday's structure lose precision, okay? They still operate, just not where activity has migrated. And it's not incompetence or anything. This is just kind of a lag. And policy often looks powerless in real time. Okay, and why is that? If you put this all together, the pattern becomes clear. Policy loses effectiveness when markets are saturated, balance sheets are constrained, confidence is impaired, or structure is shifted. At that point, additional moves generate headlines or move prices briefly, but fail to change behavior. From the outside, it looks like good word would be probably paralysis. From the inside, it looks like working with limited leverage. Okay, but what actually ends these periods? It's an uncomfortable truth, I think. Periods where policy seems ineffective usually end because balance sheets reset, prices adjust enough to restore incentives, or stress forces restructuring. And not because policy suddenly finds a new lever. Policy can support that transition. It can contain damage. It can stabilize markets, but it cannot shortcut adjustment. That's not a failure. It's a boundary. So what I want you to remember about this is monetary policy doesn't stop working because tools disappear. It stops working because incentives saturate, constraints bind, confidence breaks, or the system evolves. Understanding this helps explain why more action doesn't always mean more impact, or policy responses can look repetitive. Or even outcomes don't follow announcements immediately, right? So, really important takeaway here. I want to thank you for listening to episode 59 of The Global Ledger. We talked about when policy, monetary policy, stops working. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about monetary policy versus market control. Really important episode as we go into, or we finish off this arc with monetary policy in practice. The final episode, episode 60, will be about monetary policy versus market control and where the line actually is. Once again, I'm Justin.